Thanks. I guess I should first say that I am doing my doctorate and I'm not doing it on China painting. So I'm not an expert on China painting. These two objects that I'm going to be talking about were recently acquired into the Gardner Museum. So that's my little caveat there. So my very first image for this Canadian Women Art History Conference is American. I apologize, but I think it's highly appropriate to my talk. 2 weeks ago, some of you might have noticed in the Globe and Mail, the Globe and Mail picked up the New York Times article on the new presidential dinner service designed, I would put it in quotation marks, by Michelle Obama. The tradition of the president's wife supposedly designing a state china pattern during her tenure dates back several centuries and then reinforces the age-old bias that China and women have this symbiotic connection. The New York Times quips that it may be the first time the teal-colored nails of the First Lady matched the border of the state service. Now, I should add that the article adds that Michelle Obama's choice of Kailua blue turquoise for the banded border and her nail polish is not from her own personal narrative, but that of her husband's, because the turquoise color is meant to pay tribute to the blue waters of the president's home state, which is, of course, Hawaii. So women embedding their personal and family narratives in china decorating and other gendered material practices and the resulting objects is nothing new, and it has been topical in recent scholarship. Notably, Anne Anderson, Cindy Brandy Marte, Cheryl Buckley, Maura Vinticelli have focused on the phenomenon of British and American china painting. However, in Canada, the subject is much neglected. My question for us this afternoon is, why has Canadian china painting to date been ignored by scholars, particularly since china decorating served as an effective tool of self-representation for Canadian women to assert their identity, individuality, and independence? To gain further insight into how and why Canadian women at the turn of the century and chose to express themselves through the very material art of porcelain painting, this paper looks at two examples of china painting recently accessioned into the Gardner Museum collection: a dish with dogwood flowers decorated in 1891 by Mary Ellen Digmon, and a stylized small Art Nouveau jug painted in 1909 by Florence Helena McGillivray. However, before examining these objects as signifiers of self-expression, a brief overview of china painting will be useful to this discussion. China decorating involves painting on a once-fired blank clear glazed tiles or dishes with overglazed enamels made of minerals distributed in envelopes, vials, or tubed, combined with a powdered flux, blended with oils, and then fired in a kiln at low temperatures. And it can be fired a second, a third time, or even up to a fifth time, so that the design, which is traced with an outline, pencil, and often copied from a pattern, fuses directly on the surface to remain permanent. The technique and skill of china painting is said to emulate the practice of watercolor painting. As has been well documented, Britain popularized the fashionable hobby of china painting in the mid-1870s, which rose out of the arts and crafts and the later aesthetic movement, and continued to find favor amongst the leisure class well into the 1920s. China painting was considered respectable employment since it could be executed in the home, but it was also acceptable to work outside the house if executed in art studios in commercial pottery such as Minton or Dolton in Britain. Now, an article in the British Ladies' Pictorial, published in 1888, is significantly titled Women at Work, and I think it's relevant to our discussion this afternoon because it focuses on remuneration, stating that a girl should expect an income of £1 a week. Not much, the author admits, but earned in a particularly pleasant manner, without the slightest suspicion of anything injurious to the physique of ever so delicate a woman. The Dolton Lambeth decorators were, in the Coventry Patmore sense of the word, angels that have left the house, but they maintained their respectability working in a pretty industry, as the author called it, because the author further observes the ladies and young girls who are hired are rarely drawn from the lower classes, so that even personal refinement is the rule. So just briefly, what was happening in Philadelphia and in America and China painting, as some of you might know, after the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876, China clubs and instructions spread across the Northeast and the southern states, and similarly had profound consequences for women founding and operating independent potteries such as Rokewood in Cincinnati. The trajectory of Canadian women China painters differs from those in the USA and Britain, partly because this country lacked a sustainable ceramic industry, preventing paintresses and China decorators to, quote, rise to the level of designers, and very few actually set up their own studios. Alice Hagen, née Egan of Nova Scotia, who made her debut decorating the Cabot service game plates, is an important exception. Perhaps because she became a studio potter in her own right, meaning that she worked in clay, she threw on the wheel, she has received more critical attention by Canadian scholars for her China painting. Notably, the recent Artist, Architecture, and Artisans Interdisciplinary Exhibition Catalog published at the National Gallery includes her work, but I should add, has no other examples of China painting in the catalog, perpetuating the problem that Canadian China painting is unworthy of academic scholarship. And I might add that she is the only artist, China painter, that is represented in the artist herself. So let's return then to the Gardner objects under study, and I would like to begin with the work of Mary Ella Digmon, since she was an important pioneer of China painting in Canada. The Canadian Women Artist History Database ably documents her legacy as a women's arts activist, organizer, leader, patron, teacher, and writer, and these achievements perhaps outweigh her contribution as an artist. She was born Mary Williams in 1857 in Port Burwell, Southern Ontario. She was privately instructed by Paul Peel in London, Ontario, where she grew up, and she went on to study in New York and Paris. She did marry and have two children. In 1886, she founded and served as the first president of the Women's Art Association of Canada. She remained president until 1913, and then she returned to this position in 1935. In her obituary on Digmon, critic Graham McInnes observed that Mrs. Digmon was not, nor did she pretend to be, an outstanding painter. She was a sincere amateur. The dish with dogwood flowers, completed in 1891, was completed 5 years after she founded the Women's Art Association. It's hand-painted and overglazed enamels on what appears to be English bone porcelain. She hand-printed in matte gold on her back her initials and date, and as indicated by the adhesive label, the plate was acquired directly from the estate of Barbara and Peter Sutton Smith, who were leading antique dealers and publishers in this country, and they would have been aware of Digmon's stature. The distinctive gilt scallop rim resembles embroidery patterns, another fashionable hobby at this time, with instructions and designs published in numerous ladies' magazines, which we can see here. So it's frequently remarked that Digmon's subject matter of still life, landscapes, and Dutch scenes was conventional. It did not reflect her progressive views about women, implying that it's difficult to read her artwork as a form of self-representation. At first glance, the floral plate may seem equally traditional, but I would argue that it represents an important signifier of Digmon's feminist leanings because it's an example of her early China painting, serving as a turning point between the amateur and the professional. In 1896, 5 years after she painted the Gardner plate, she authored several articles and reports about China painting in Canada, in which she asserts that painted China was a woman's domain because it appeals, even before pictures, to the house furnitures and entertainers. So there's a large field to be occupied, which will be exclusively to the woman artists, she says. She also adds that the art is now made so easy that ambitious students living in more remote districts or in smaller towns and villages may not be deprived of the pleasure of painting on China, as China could be sent from the larger centers by the importer safely, and that students no longer need to travel to the USA to learn this skill. Digmon is commenting really on the plethora specialty journals like China Decorator, as well as other instruction books and how-to articles on China decorating. So I briefly, in my research here, went through the Ladies' Home Journal published in Philadelphia, and there were countless articles offering such helpful, detailed hints about China painting, such as where to place the painting table so that the north light will fall on your work over your left shoulder, to limit your palette to 25 colors, to use large brushes for a broad style, and that another article cautions do not make strong outlines with the pencil and suit your design to the shape. The objective of these articles and these guidebooks and other publications was to simplify the steps for the amateur so she could emulate the professional. For Digmon, striving to be a professional was a serious ambition and strategy to elevate women to the arts to stimulate self-reliance. In her publications, she actually addresses the economic impact of China painting in Canada, stating that China imported for decoration $20,000 annually. And when they're actually decorated, when the blanks are decorated, they're resold for over $100,000. She then estimates that another $100,000 is generated by the profession through teaching, and concludes that the tax revenue for imported China paints and gold become a windfall in earned revenue for the government. Where Digmon actually finds these statistics, and if they're accurate, for this paper I don't think it's relevant, because what I think is significant here is that she felt compelled to cite them in her reports, to underscore and elevate China painting to a professional industry, albeit a dainty one. So 6 years in, after painting the dogwood plate, Digmon undertook her greatest venture into China decorating, art directing what's known as the Cabot Commemorative Service, which is now in Haddle Hall in Scotland. Thanks to the scholarship of the late Marie Elwood, information on the service can actually be found on the Canadian Museum History's website, which I have slides of right here. Comprising of 204 pieces, the 8-course dinner service for the 24 celebrated the 400th anniversary of John Cabot's discovery of Canada. Digmon formed the committee, she organized the competition, she sourced the imagery of Canadian flora and fauna, and the historical sites for content. 16 female artists were selected, half of them from Ontario, the balance from Quebec and Nova Scotia. So she never actually painted anything herself, but she really directed this service. And it was presented to Lady Aberdeen, the patron of the Women Art Association of Canada, wife of the Governor General, as a going-away commemorative gift, and the total production cost for this service was about $1,000. And in typical Canadian fashion, the Canadian government refused to pay for it. And so she then the consummate networker, went on to secure the funds privately from members of the House of Commons and the Senate. Therefore, and here's a detail which I thought was appropriate because it's an image of Kingston, so for you. But I would argue, though, that this plate with dogwood flowers of 1892 should not be read as a singular work of home decor, but as an early signal indicating Digmon's positioning of China painting outside of the domestic sphere to serve as a touchstone for industry and nationalism expressed by wives and daughters. Digmon frequently exhibited her paintings with the Royal Academy of Artists and the Ontario Society of Artists, but these societies refused her membership, which some have attributed to her forceful personality. I thought this photograph might suggest as such. But it was a different story for her friend Florence Helen McGilvray, who was a member of both societies, as well as the Women's Arts Association. So she was born in Whitby, Ontario in 1864, and McGilvray was a noted sketcher and painter of landscape painting who studied under William Cruikshank at the Ontario School of Art, and she also taught at the Ontario Ladies' College at Whitby. The AGO, the Art Gallery of Hamilton, and the Agnes Etherington Centre here have examples of her paintings. The National Gallery of Canada acquired 2 McGilvray's paintings in 1914 during her lifetime when she was 50 years old. I have here represented Afterglows is probably one of her better known works and reflects her friendship with Tom Thompson. McGilvary's position as a painter is certainly more acclaimed than Digmon's, but her work as a china decorator is less known. So donated last year to the Gardner Museum by Barbara Mitchell, a recent past president of the Women's Arts Association of Canada, McGilvary, and I believe she's probably attending this talk, or maybe not, but I know she's at the conference. McGilvary completed this small stylized jug in 1909 after studying the technique with Marshall Fry in New York City, and after she completed further studies in Europe. As with Digmon, she signed and dated the piece, and she would have probably used a lithographic pencil to outline the design on the glaze surface. Painted 18 years later than the Digmon's design, after she visited Europe, as I said, the sinuous stems and the luster glaze are in a conventionalized Art Nouveau. However, other earlier examples of decorated china by McGilvary, such as those scalloped dishes featuring morning glories and strawberries, are in the same floral pictorial vein as Digmon's dogwood with flowers. McGilvary also, in the 1890s, worked very briefly in the genre of portraiture. And here we see a portrait of her mother represented on a porcelain tile and a china bracelet. The same image is used for both, and it comes from an 1890s photograph. The tile descended from the artist's estate, while the bracelet's provenance derives from her sisters. They are therefore a testament to china painting being employed as a keepsake memento rather than a commercial exchange. And I'd like to thank Bill Allen, a relative, who is writing a monograph on McGilvary, who shared these images with me. So then how do we read McGilvary's china painting, or Digmon's for that matter? To many, the decoration and imagery may be perceived as empty ciphers drained of any content, to paraphrase Llewellyn Negrin, while others, it evokes a feminine pastime ideal for wife and mother. No matter that McGilvary was an independent artist and teacher who actually never married. And incidentally, when I was doing a lot of research for this paper, which was reviewing the archives at the Women's Art Association of Canada, the exhibition catalogs of the china painters listed more than half the members of the China Club people as unmarried, Mrs., not Mrs. So also interestingly is how the Globe at the time would review these 1890s exhibitions organized by Digmon under the auspices of the Women's Art Association. They similarly employed a very feminine terminology in their critical appraisal of the china, opting for words like dainty, delicate, decorative, exquisite, harmonious, pretty, tasteful. And the gallery decor was described as most tastefully arranged with walls draped in cream and pale green for the soft, beautiful effect. Now, Cheryl Buckley and other contemporary feminist scholars have observed that the critical vocabulary used to describe women's work often reflects the biology of the maker themselves. And this is certainly the case with china painting. But as Buckley has shown us, the terminology and the objects themselves are just one aspect of the story. It is the networks of exchange that is revealing of biography and other societal factors. So Digmon and McGilvary were caught up in what was called then the China Mania or China craze. And then Digmon in her reports has correctly observed that Canada lacked ceramic factories, and those that existed here were utilitarian. And thus it was entirely in the hands of the individual artists who, by banding together, have shown that every kind of decoration may be accomplished. Therefore, the very act of learning, acquiring blanks from the US and Europe, sourcing kilns either individually or as a group, was a declaration. It was demanding. It was expensive, particularly in comparison to other crafts of the period. By 1891, though, we know that china decorators could purchase in Toronto from William Journer the necessary infrastructure for china painting, as well as finished products. Similarly, to fuel consumption for china, Eaton's also advertised in the Women's Art Association catalogs, and Eaton's would sell blanks in splendid assortment. It would also sell the enamels, the colors, and it would even offer kiln firing as part of the surface. Sourcing the kilns was particularly an involved endeavor, especially when multiple firings were required, and you would always need multiple firings if you wanted gilding, for example. But by 1896, the Canadian Home Journal was advertising that kilns were being sold, and it was a genteel business for ladies and gentlemen. Now, this was the first encounter that I came across it being targeted for gentlemen, which I think is quite interesting. So under the auspices of the Women's Art Association, China clubs formed in Toronto, Montreal, Hamilton, Winnipeg, and other cities. And as documented in the minute books of the Toronto China Club, which I happened to go through, members, what they focused on was education, pricing the china, which was high, revenues which were earned, which was low, bringing in teachers, usually from Central Tech, attending lectures, usually from, it was Professor Corelli from the ROM, defining what was good design, what was bad design, and visiting utilitarian potteries, and then also going out and sketching with your camera outdoors. And all of this was in pursuit of an expanding knowledge for the application of painting on china. As the minutes of the Toronto chapter reveal, exhibitions, that's what members were mostly concerned about. Where to exhibit, who could exhibit, should it be members or not members, and what to exhibit. So, and they would discuss the rules of engagement for the competition. Usually you were allowed to choose your own piece, but each design would share the same motif. And you would begin with an outline, and that was what the outline would be offered for criticism. So in 1915, the Toronto China Club actually selected the wild rose motif, and they invited a male instructor from Central Tech to judge it and judge the critique. McGillivray's Jardiniere, featuring roses, is a typical example of this rose motif and really doesn't depart much from the Ceramic Studio journal published a few years earlier on how to paint roses on your china painting or on your or for your watercolors. So despite, I would say, the ambitions of the China painters of the time and of Digmon, the critic, Robert Holmes, dismissed China painting in that same year, 1915, for his review of the Toronto Applied Art Show at the CNE for the Evening Standard. And he published often repeated obtrusions of bunches of roses and designs more than reminiscent of various ceramic publications prompt one to sidestep when confronted with a display of china painting. Generally speaking, there seems to be less originality of design and more childlike faith in the illustrated journal of those who painting well on china than among the other good workers in any other of the applied arts. Faint praise indeed. Such a statement reveals that the bias against china painting in Canada has a long tradition. So I'm going to conclude by returning to the Digmon and McGillivray pieces at the Gardner Museum and to question how might these china works be read as portraits of ideal femininity. That is, stand-ins for the perfect wife and mother. Well, it's clear I think that they shouldn't be read as such. They're not simply feminine decorations in splendid isolation. And if we avoid their thingness, to use the jargon, that is, their aesthetic and economic values, and focus on how they materialize the identities of their makers, and realize how they gave them a sense of agency and reveal a more complex social system of conceptualizing, producing, and circulating, they are really filled with these social meetings. So then I'm going to draw upon what Talia Schaefer has said, and I would argue that Canadian china painting, often bordering on kitsch, is not a neglected art deserving of new appreciation, but rather presents a lens into how women intersected with the material world as a way of doing things, and thus serves as a kind of biographical tool of self-identity and determination. That these two hand-painted china artifacts actually entered the collection of the Gardner Museum, an institution devoted to elite ceramic art with the holdings of European 18th century Meissen, Sèvres, and Chelsea, is a testament to the increasing awareness of the importance of interpreting ceramics beyond the usual canon of connoisseurship in favor of material culture relating to our social histories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So these two dishes speak not only to changing taste from pictorial to conventionalized design to Canada's burgeoning home decoration and ceramics industry, but more importantly, how women transformed a leisure pastime of generic patterns of flora on porcelain as expressions of independence through their networks of learning, exhibiting, and meeting and consuming all outside the domestic sphere. Thank you.